Hello, class, and back again with Module 2. I'm going to talk about objectives 3 and 4. And without further ado, I am sharing my screen and getting that slideshow up. Okay. Oh, come on now. Okay. Anyway, I gotta get to the slide. Okay, objective number 3. I'm going to explain the exposure model or the effects of brain structure and function. So let's go back to the exposure model that we talked about early on in Module 2. The exposure model is a disease model, but it basically says that rather than having a predisposition or a susceptibility or a disease at birth, maybe from genetics, what happens is that when you take substances, when you ingest substances, those change your brain and give your brain a disease, more or less. So the disease is caused by changes in brain function. And there's a lot of evidence, indeed, that we see changes in brain function as a result of taking drugs. And when I say drugs, of course, I mean alcohol as well. So let's take a look at what this looks like. And we're going to do a little bit of review of how the brain works. So I'm not going to teach you this in a huge amount of detail, but I want you to kind of go back and review. I'm going to review a little bit about how neurons make up the brain and how they communicate with one another. So our brain at the smallest particulate level is made up of all of these neurons. And here's an example of a neuron in the brain. Now, a normal cell more or less looks like this, but a neuron has more extensions here. It's got these branches called dendrites, and it's got the cell body is similar to any other cell. Here's the nucleus in there. And then it's got this other extension called an axon. And the axon is going to basically be sending a signal to another neuron. Neurons can also connect with other things, but in this case, we're just going to talk about neurons in the brain that are generally connected to other neurons. So here's another neuron connection down here. This is the axon of one neuron. Remember, axon terminal just means end of the axon. The axon of one neuron connected to the dendrite of another. So if you can imagine another neuron over here, it would be this part of the neuron that you're seeing pictured there. Okay, so now if we take this little box and we blow it up, here's what you see here, and we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so let's explain some of this text. So you have this brain, which you can break down into various parts of the brain, and we'll talk about that, or you can break it down even further into the smallest parts of the brain, which are the neurons. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about now. The brain is made up of neurons that communicate with one another. They send signals to one another. And that communication involves a chemical. And that chemical is one of many, many types of neurotransmitters. So we call that chemical a neurotransmitter. So let's get down to here, and we'll kind of look at how that neurotransmitter happens. So initially, the axon is going to send, you can see it says direction of signal. It's going to send an electrical signal down here, and that's what these arrows represent. When that electricity gets to the bottom here, it causes these little bubbles that we call vesicles to fuse with the edge of the neuron or the membrane and spill out. Now, inside of those vesicles are neurotransmitter molecules. These are these chemicals, right? Now, on the dendrite of the other neuron, there are what we call receptor sites. And those receptors are going to pick up those chemicals, and that is going to inspire this neuron to either fire an electrical signal or not fire. In the case of some neurotransmitters are inhibitory and some are excitatory, but at any rate, this neuron will be changed because of that. So it is that communication between axon and dendrite in that space in between, which we call a synapse, that is going to, where neurotransmitter is going to be transferred. Information is going to be transferred from one neuron to another. And knowing about neurotransmitters will help us understand the way that drugs work and the way that tolerance and withdrawal works. Okay, so moving right along, let's just go review this just one more time. Here we've got an electrical signal that's going through the axon, and it's connected to a dendrite of another neuron here. And we're going to be passing some neurotransmitters right here at what we call the synapse, which is this area here. This is blown up, right? Axon of one neuron, dendrite of another. And this in this synapse, in this space, is where those neurotransmitters are going to be spilled out. So there's one more thing in here that I want to talk about, which is the transporter. The transporter is involved in regulating how much neurotransmitter there is. So what happens after the neurotransmitter crosses the synapse and it interacts with these receptors over here and changes the second neuron, then a lot of times, depending upon the neurotransmitter, it gets sucked back up into the previous neuron. So now the neurotransmitter is going the other direction because the synapse is clearing out. It's done its job, it's affected the next neuron, and now it's being sucked back up. And what sucks it up is called the transporter. So drugs have many, many kinds of actions in the brain. Sometimes they increase the production of the neurotransmitter. Sometimes they change the number of receptor sites. Sometimes they can reverse the transporter. For example, like cocaine and methamphetamines reverse the transporter. So instead of sucking it up, the neurotransmitter, it pushes it out, and that will create a lot more neurotransmitter in here. So essentially, psychoactive drugs, what they're doing is that they're changing the amount of activity of these neurotransmitters. And they're doing it in a lot of different ways depending upon the drug. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about an area of the brain called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. And that is an area that we call the reward center of the brain, or the reward circuit of the brain. And this is an area where the neurons there are using the neurotransmitter dopamine. Okay, so different neurons use different kinds of neurotransmitter, but this is a very heavily what we call dopaminergic area, meaning that these neurons in this area use a lot of dopamine. What happens is that dopamine is released from this ventral tegmental area, and that creates dopamine release in a lot of different places in the brain. Here you can see in the frontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, and the amygdala here. And there are other areas as well, like the ventral striatum, that we'll talk less about. But this reward circuit seems to be involved in drug use, and especially addictive drug use. So dopamine, as I mentioned, is a key neurotransmitter here. Now, let's just go for somebody who's not using drugs at all. If you don't use drugs at all, is your mesolimbic dopamine pathway still active? Yes, of course it's active. How it's active is when you do something rewarding, something that feels good. Maybe you go get out and get an ice cream at Dairy Queen or something like that, and you eat, and it's just like, oh, this is so good. That's your mesolimbic dopamine pathway that, again, is just shooting out the dopamine there. And it's also active during sex. And eating and sex, those are all kinds of survival sorts of things. So that's built into us evolutionarily speaking. We have this pathway to remind us to do this stuff regularly. And so when we get this message, it says, oh, that was good. Do that again. Go to Dairy Queen again and get that same thing again, right? And so, and you have sex, they say, do that again. That was good. Let me find those conditions. Do that again. And again, that's built in so that for survival reasons, and of course to pass on our genes, sex being doing that. Okay. What the deal is that drugs, many psychoactive drugs have hijacked that system. And I say hijacked, all they're working on the system. They're working in the same way that eating your Dairy Queen is working on the system. But here's the difference. When you eat your Dairy Queen, your dopamine goes up like eat. And when you take cocaine, your dopamine goes, wah! It's like huge, right? So your dopamine response to this system is far greater. So it turns out it's super rewarding. So when you eat Dairy Queen, you go, oh, I should go there again. And when you take cocaine, it's like, yeah, let me get some more of that. That's the problem with it. So it's got a very high value in creating dopamine activity, and also becomes high value to us as a reward, psychologically speaking. Okay, so let's take apart a few of the areas in this system. The reward center includes, as I was saying, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway includes the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is involved in motor behavior primarily. It's a motor area, so it has to do with movement. And when the dopamine activity gets to that area, it basically says, oh, it takes note of what went on. Oh, okay, this is Dairy Queen. It's on the business loop. Let me just take that in mind so I know how to get that again, right? Your frontal cortex is about, it's sort of reasoning. It's making sure you can do things in a reasonable way. It's planning. It's impulse control. Well, I should eat dinner before I eat Dairy Queen and stuff like that. And it's also reasoning how to get the Dairy Queen, well, I could get it because I only had it yesterday, and it's okay if I have Dairy Queen once a day, because again, it wants that reward. And then the amygdala is involved in learning the association between pleasure and the drug, or pleasure and ice cream, or whatever, that pleasurable feeling that we get. Now, I say the nucleus accumbens provides the high, and some people, I think, have traditionally thought that. But one of the things about dopamine that's changed in recent years is that people started recognizing that dopamine it was always called the pleasure neurotransmitter, the pleasure chemical, because it was involved in this reward system. But as it turns out, many people who are addicted to drugs do not feel pleasure. Instead, they're taking drugs to feel normal or to avoid pain. And so we've started thinking of dopamine as sort of being involved in wanting something rather than liking something. But nonetheless, there are highs that come from drugs. Those are probably accomplished by other neurotransmitters, perhaps dopamine as well. One that you've probably heard of, but that is a good candidate for that are the endorphins. And the endorphins are kind of, you've heard of the runner's high and all of that. It's supposed to be because of endorphins. Endorphins may also be involved in the highs that we get from taking psychoactive substances. Okay. So we've got all of these areas that are involved in bringing us back, do this again, because it's rewarding. So just to kind of review what's going on here, the substance, when you take a psychoactive substance, for example, like cocaine, it's going to flood the system with dopamine, lots and lots of dopamine. And the more dopamine, the more effective it is at increasing dopamine, basically, the more addictive it is. So less addictive drugs tend to do less dopamine, and more addictive drugs like methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin, those just really jack up the dopamine. So The substance floods the system with dopamine. The dopamine gives us this rewarding feeling, or at least a wanting feeling. I want this. I've got to get more of this. And that reward is reinforcing the act of drug use. And so then, all of these areas work together to go, oh, how do I get that again? How do I get that again? Remember that this is a normal process, and it aided in survival. If an animal, one of our ancestors, let's say, comes upon a fruit tree and finds a nice sweet fruit, and you get that dopamine burst, it behooves that animal to then find that again. And so it makes sense that this circuit is in place. But again, what happens with psychoactive substances is that they capitalize on the circuit, and they're very high value rewards. They're very good at working this circuit. So what happens as you start to use regularly, let's say you're using meth regularly, and so every day you're flooding that reward circuit with dopamine, the motivation to use the drug starts to get stronger because the brain sort of gets used to that. Also, these natural rewards like food and sex, I mean, like, who wants food when there's meth around? You know what I mean? So, because remember, food raises dopamine like this, meth raises it like this. So basically the motivation to get the meth becomes stronger than those things that would normally be pleasurable in life don't seem as pleasurable. Okay, now that you know a little bit about how this reward circuit works and a little bit about how the neuron works, you can understand the neurobiological basis of tolerance. So if you use and use and use and use something like meth, what happens is the synapse in between neurons there gets flooded with dopamine all the time, because meth is really good at getting at that dopamine, right? And so you have tons and tons of dopamine in there. Well, the brain down-regulates because it says, whoa, that's a lot of dopamine. So your brain kind of knows better than to get that much. So it's got this homeostatic mechanism that then essentially remove some of the effects of dopamine. And how it does that is a couple of different ways, but I'm going to talk about getting rid of some of those receptors, because on the dendrite, remember, there's a whole bunch of receptors over here. Well, rather than having 5 receptors, all of a sudden the brain with all that dopamine goes, I'm not going to leave my middle finger up. Okay, all of a sudden there's only one receptor, so I got all this dopamine, dopamine, and there's only one receptor, so it can't affect this neuron very much, even though that synapse is flooded with dopamine. So what happens is that the brain becomes relatively insensitive. And then what happens is you need more of the drug to be able to stimulate that one single receptor enough. So with the receptor populations down, we end up having to use more and more and more and more of the drug. And that is where we get to tolerance. To get the same kind of effect, you have to use more. As I mentioned before, the dopamine is involved in wanting more than liking. And again, that liking or that high or that, oh, this drug feels good and stuff like that. For people who are addicted, many of them do not report a really good feeling upon taking the drug. It instead becomes more about feeling normal or feeling okay or avoiding the pain of withdrawal. Now you should be able to understand withdrawal as well. So I'm just going to explain real quick withdrawal. If you stop taking the drug, remember, you've only got one receptor, and you've been kicking out this huge amount of dopamine, but we only got one little receptor there. So your brain is really insensitive to it, and you're taking a ton of the drug to be able to get that much dopamine. Now you stop taking the drug. Well, remember, dopamine is still released when you eat, when you have sex, when you have social engagements and stuff like that. There's lots of stuff that increases dopamine environmentally. And but it's all in like little small amounts, little tiny amounts. And remember, your brain is relatively insensitive because your receptor population is so low that now you feel like crap, right? And it takes a while of being off of the drug before bleep, 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 bleep. Now your receptor population has grown up some more, and now you have a normal amount of dopamine acting normally in the brain. So when you first stop the drug and the drug clears from your system, withdrawal often happens, and withdrawal makes you feel like crap. I'll talk about that a little bit later, and I already talked about it a little bit. And you can actually die from withdrawal. It's like that serious, depending upon the drug. Okay, last objective for this chapter, objective number 4, we're going to identify historical disease concepts and their flaws, because unfortunately, the disease models don't entirely hold up. And preview, we haven't really paid enough attention to the environment. And so in later chapters, we're going to look a little bit about how this environment works and how learning takes place in the case of drug addiction. Okay, so let's talk about some of the historical disease concepts. So one historical disease concept is that the disease is primary, and that has to do with, so primary means first, right? That has to do with having a predisposition for the disease. And we've talked about that already in terms of genetic predisposition and stuff like that. Loss of control, we also mentioned earlier. This is the idea that a person with a primary disease, if I take, I'll talk about nicotine because I am addicted to nicotine, as I've told you, though I am not a smoker, I am addicted to nicotine. The idea there is that if I take any nicotine, I take it in the form of nicotine gum, then I've kind of completely lost control, and now I'm just overboard, and I just can take as much or whatever. I spiral into, out of control. Another concept is that it's a progressive disease. So once you have the disease, so for example, if you have an addiction to alcohol, then it is going to get worse. If you don't get treated, it just progresses until you have some serious physical problems. And then finally, it's chronic. It is going to last essentially forever. You're really never disease-free, even if you manage to get off of the alcohol. Okay, so addiction as a primary disease, and that's this idea that the disease causes substance use, and that is very popular with the disease model, is that you are born with this vulnerability, and that's why certain people end up using substances and others do not. The popular view, however, is a little bit different, and that's that the substance causes the addiction. The alcohol studies show that evidence for both, really, with alcohol. And what we see is that early onset alcohol use is associated with genetic factors. So people who have alcohol running in their families, they tend to start drinking a lot earlier. It tends to be more severe and more progressive. But a lot of other people who end up with alcohol use disorder, it is associated more with environmental factors, and especially that's true for the late onset. And I think the early onset is prior to 25. The late onset is after 25. And we see that with a lot of different disorders, including Parkinson's disorder and many other disorders, in which an early onset of the disorder is more associated with genetics, and the later onset is more associated with environmental factors. So at any rate, both are true, that it is a primary disease, but it's not a primary disease for everyone. So the addiction as a primary disease concept doesn't, again, really hold up. Okay, that's one of the problems with these historical concepts. But addiction as a primary disease doesn't hold up for everyone. Well, it does hold up for some. Okay, let's take a look at loss of control. This is another key idea behind the disease models. Loss of control is that you're powerless over use. We've seen this with Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, step 1, as you can see in the picture there with Alcoholics Anonymous, is that we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives have become unmanageable. You just basically say, I have no power over this stuff. I have a defect. I have an abnormality caused by a genetic problem, probably, or an allergy, as AA said in the very beginning. And the idea there is that if I take even one sip, I'm out of control. All of a sudden, my body has spiraled into, gotta use, gotta use, gotta use. And so one sip will end up being heavy use. And it is because of this concept, the concept of loss of control, that many, many therapies, especially in the United States, have said, you've got to have abstinence. We just got to go off of this stuff. We got to get through any withdrawal and then try to maintain being off of it altogether. But in many other countries, and for example, in Europe, we see a lot of therapies using moderate use. And so that's the idea that you could reduce your use of, say, alcohol, but not stop it altogether. And it is possible. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But with this idea of loss of control, thinks that moderate use is not possible. Now, I should say, many, many people who have been addicted to drugs and alcohol, this idea fits with them. It just makes sense to them. They feel like they don't have control. But the problem is that research doesn't entirely support that. So let's talk about that. The criticisms of loss of control is that when a person lapses, which is when they, that would be kind of like, if you stop smoking, that one night you're out and you have a cigarette or something like that, that would be a lapse. But what's usually termed a relapse is when you just kind of go whole hog back into smoking. At any rate, the lapses don't always result in heavy use. Sometimes the lapses happen and people come back. So the concept of loss of control is like, once I get a drop in me, then I'm going to, go all out and into heavy use. And what we see also is that prior to a lapse or prior to relapse, the person will start planning stuff, prior to using, the person is planning a lot of things in their mind. So, for example, we've noted in research, a lot of people who binge drink, they plan to binge drink. It's not like they took one sip and then lost control. They, in fact, may think like, well, I'm going to binge drink tonight. So therefore, I should try to get a ride or take an Uber or whatever. I'm going to go to this party and I'm going to bring a 12-pack of beer and I'm going to drink it, right? Okay, so that all that planning suggests, that there is some control involved because they don't lose control when they take a sip. Okay, so the other thing is that the data suggests that reducing use, even if you're not abstinent, doesn't result in better outcomes for people. And many, many people who are addicted to substances can moderately use. So there are therapies that work that just cut down use as opposed to eliminate it altogether. Okay. Next concept that, and once again, we're going to tear apart because these concepts have problems, it is the idea that addiction is a progressive disease. It's just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse if it's not treated, or if you don't stop, it's just going to keep going up and up and up. And then, you're going to have mild problems, and then you're going to have progressively more severe problems. Your condition will worsen. The data, again, don't support it. With substance use disorder, it usually doesn't follow predictable stages. In some people, it does that, but not in everybody. And so you get, in fact, even the symptoms that you experience, we've got, 11 or so symptoms in the DSM-5. People get different symptoms and different combinations of symptoms. So we can't really predict it in that way where for everybody it does that progressive thing. On top of that, and this is interesting, even without treatment, generally people with alcohol use anyway tend to mature out. Many people do. So alcohol use is going to tend to peak in the 20s for men, in the 30s for women, but then after that, it tends to go down. That's not true of everybody. Some people do have alcohol use disorder as a progressive disease, but many, many, many people, even without any treatment, tend to mature out of it. As they mature, they start to drink less. So let me talk a little bit about that maturing out. That's this natural remission without any treatment at all. What we think is that maybe substance use may be a way of coping with a lot of life challenges, and you may be in that now. You may find yourself using substances because you're stressed about this or that, and it's hard to deal with. It's hard to deal with all the stuff that you guys are dealing with work, with school, with relationships, with parents, living situations, financial problems, right? As you master those situations, and you will, and your stress will go down as you get older over things like that, generally. Maybe that's why use is decreasing. So the data suggests maturing out does happen. People do tend to go down even without treatment. Not everybody, but many people do. And on top of that, substance use is highly influenced by environmental conditions. So, being in college may be one of those environmental conditions for you if you're, for example, drinking or using marijuana. Key life events play a big role in substance use. So things like getting married, getting a partner, full-time work, getting a full-time job. These may influence your substance use pattern. So again, the disease model doesn't really pay too much attention to some of that environmental stuff. And in later chapters, we'll see how that environmental stuff really does make a difference. Okay. Addiction, finally, the last concept of the disease model is that addiction is a chronic disease. Chronic means it never goes away. And that's why sometimes you hear, for example, with AA, they will never say, somebody's gone through AA, may have been abstinent for 20 years, won't say that they have recovered. Instead, they say they are recovering, because the idea is that the disease never goes away. And if you were to start drinking again, then the disease would manifest itself again quite quickly. So abstinence is absolutely necessary under this idea. Well, we know already that, because I've already talked to you about moderate drinking, that is possible. So this chronicity idea doesn't really get supported by research. It seems as though some people can go from very heavy drinking to moderate drinking. Some people mature out of heavy drinking. And so this idea of this chronic disease that lasts forever. I want to just touch on the difference between chronic and progressive. Progressive means it gets worse and worse and worse. Chronic, it means it just goes on and on forever. So, you could have a progressive disease that is acute, meaning it has an ending, or you could have a progressive disease that is chronic, goes on and on. Okay, so they are different things, but at any rate, the disease models think that both are there, and once again, the evidence doesn't really support it. Okay, so I want to just sum this all up to say that addiction is a primary disease, that it's a genetic defect or whatever, that you lack control in addiction, that it's always progressive, gets worse and worse, that it's chronic and lasting forever, just isn't true of all users. The data show that. It is possibly true of some users. I'm not saying it's untrue, but that's where the disease models kind of mess up a little bit. Okay, so to sum up, I just want to say the disease models have been great. Don't get me wrong, I realize I'm criticizing them, but the disease models have done a lot to decrease stigma, because you remember the moral model that you're choosing to do this freely and you are doing something sinful, and I was like, that was terrible. So the disease models are way better than that. They have decreased punishment, they have increased compassionate treatment, which we need for addictions, and they've increased treatment dollars. And society has largely adopted this disease model. So people are in support of putting money toward treatment, and those are all great things. But many of the concepts of the disease model are not strongly grounded in evidence. We need more. And one of the things that we need badly is to pay attention to some of the environmental and societal influences of addictive processes. And next time in module 3, we're going to go into some public health stuff that really gives us some grounding in that. I hope you are enjoying these lectures and enjoying the class and doing well. And I'm signing off in a minute if I can stop sharing. Okay, you guys have a great day.